Put together, the Eastern Orthodox churches form the second largest Christian denomination in the world, the largest being Catholicism and the third largest being Anglicanism. Though if you were to combine all of the Protestant churches together into a single grouping, that would absolutely dwarf Eastern Orthodoxy, but remain considerably smaller than Roman Catholicism. Now, in sessions 26 through 29 of this series, we dealt in some depth with the Church of the East and the Oriental Orthodox churches, and the situation in the Church in India, where these two different bodies, the Church in the East, the Oriental Orthodox churches, historically entwined in various ways. And today we're going to take a closer look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, which visually, in many ways, spiritually and culturally, appears on the surface quite similar to these other bodies, the Oriental and the Church of the East, though there are theologically significant distinctions and disagreements. So do not confuse these different groups of Christians. That could be quite offensive indeed. Let's recap some of this history though, because this is a good stage to do it in the series, but also because ultimately the story of the Eastern Orthodox churches is deeply tied to the history of the Second Rome, Constantinople, and the so-called Third Rome of Russia and Moscow. Now, Christianity spread fastest in the earliest centuries in the Eastern Mediterranean, within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, though it certainly expanded beyond the Roman Empire. It was there in Armenia that we find the first nation to officially name itself as Christian, with a state Christian religion, in about 300 AD. Constantine the Great, who converted to Christianity in 312, would unite the Roman Empire definitively in 324 and move the capital from Rome in Italy to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. He would call the very next year, 325, remember that date, the First Ecumenical Council of the Church, the Council of Nicaea. But the Roman Empire itself would not adopt Christianity as a state religion until about 380 AD under Emperor Theodosius. By this time, Armenia, as I said, had already adopted it around the year 300, but also the nation of Georgia in the Caucasus had already, like nearby Armenia, adopted Christianity as a state religion in around 319 AD. In both Armenia and in Georgia, the creation of new alphabets in which to translate the Bible and write down the local language was central to the success of the missionaries in reaching more than just a few key nobles who knew Greek, but the hearts and the minds of the peoples. The evangelization of much of Egypt and Syria and places outside the borders of the Roman Empire in the east and in the south likewise was often done most successfully in the local language, whether it was Coptic in Egypt or Syriac and various languages in Syria and to the east. Christianity at this time within the Roman Empire centred around Rome in the west, and theologically between Antioch in Syria and Alexandria in Egypt in the east, with Jerusalem and Constantinople increasingly becoming more and more important. These five centres of the faith, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, all of the major cities in the Roman Empire, apart from Jerusalem, were the seat of the patriarchs. In 431, following the Third Ecumenical Council, the Council of Ephesus, the Church of the East, also known as the Assyrian Church, historically centred around Antioch, broke away because it supported the teachings of Nestorius. Now, this led to nearly all the churches outside the Roman Empire to the east leaving the church, and it is doubtless that politics played some factor in this, with the endless conflict between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire certainly having a factor. Armenia and Georgia, independent nations in the Caucasus, remained part of the main fold of the imperial Christian Church, even though they weren't part of the empire. But the issues raised and discussed at the Council of Ephesus, all about how Jesus could be fully God and fully man, yet one person, continued to simmer within the empire and were only finally dealt with at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. This time it was Alexandria in Egypt which could not stand by the ruling of the council, and so the Oriental Orthodox Church would break away, centred at Alexandria with the Copts, but also congregations in Syria, and critically the Armenian Church would all break away, but Georgia would remain within the fold of the empire-based Christianity. But Egypt and Syria still remained within the Roman Empire, and so what ended up happening was there would be multiple bishops and patriarchs at the same time. In Alexandria there would be an Oriental Orthodox bishop looking after his churches, and an imperial bishop looking after their churches, looking after their congregations. Now, to understand the church at this point, and to understand actually why the Eastern bishops and Rome would separate, you need to understand a concept called autocephaly, which is a great word, autocephalous, and it means self-headed. Auto for self and cephaly for head. Autocephaly. And the idea here is that the bishop in an autocephalous church has no one else above them whatsoever. So Alexandria was a self-headed church, and Antioch could not tell Alexandria what to do. Likewise, Jerusalem couldn't tell Constantinople what to do, and Rome couldn't tell other churches in the east what to do, and they couldn't tell Rome what to do. This is essentially also the practice in Anglicanism, where the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Primate of England, cannot tell the Archbishop of Nigeria, the Primate of Nigeria, what he should do, nor for that matter can the Archbishop of Canterbury tell the Archbishop of York what he should do. In a autocephalous church, each province or nation or church body has its own head bishop, called a patriarch or an archbishop or a primate, who is the equal of the heads of all the other national or regional churches. Now, one of these historically might be seen as first among equals. That's Constantinople in the Eastern Orthodox Church, or Canterbury generally speaking within Anglicanism. But no one is actually first and able to tell them what to do, which is what the Pope wanted and envisioned his role as being, and hence eventually the split between East and West. So back to Eastern Orthodoxy, now we have a grasp on this idea of it being an autocephalous church, a church made up of national or regional churches with their own head, but who all agree that they are part of this one denomination, this one Eastern Orthodox Church. Around the year 500, you had Greece and modern-day Turkey and large parts of the Balkans and southern Italy under the direct control of the Byzantine Empire and also of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And you had Christians loyal to the empire and the councils in Egypt and Syria and Jerusalem under their own patriarchs, and you also had the autocephalous, the independently run churches of Cyprus, and by this time also Georgia. These are now churches that could appoint their own bishops and archbishops, and Cyprus and Georgia had been granted that independence, that autocephality, it's a great word, throughout the 400s for largely political and historical reasons. But then in the 600s comes the Muslim invasions, which sweep away from the empire, Egypt and Jerusalem and Antioch. And although faithful imperial Christians remain in these places, and they keep on appointing their own patriarchs and their own bishops, as do the Oriental and the Church of the East, their connection to the imperial church, the Byzantine Church, the Church of the Byzantine Empire, centred in Constantinople, becomes very difficult. And essentially, the Church of Constantinople, the Byzantine Church, becomes the undisputed, uncontested centre of the church in Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Church. Over the next 300 years, from the 600s, the Byzantine Church is quite insular, but this changes in the 800s, when there is intense missionary work beginning to be done in the Balkans. And this is what caused this. It's difficult to ascertain exactly why there was this change from being quite inward focused to being quite externally focused, but it's likely down to the Patriarch of Constantinople at this time, someone we have met before when discussing Charlemagne. This is Photios the Great, who was an intellectual giant, a key player in the schism, the split between East and West, because he rejected the authority of the Pope to have anything to say in the Eastern Church. He was a compiler of church law and church history. He was a theologian. In fact, some people have even said that he's the only theologian in the history of the church to successfully pull a theological practical joke in all of history. Maybe we can discuss that another time. And Photius was the kind of man who was so outstanding in his abilities that he went straight from being a layman to being Patriarch of Constantinople in 5 days, being ordained lector on one day, subdeacon the next day, deacon the next day, priest the next day, and then on Christmas Day, 858, bishop and patriarch of Constantinople. And Photius was a missionary at heart, and in 862 he sent 2 brothers, Cyril and Methodius, to Great Moravia, a West Slavic state centred around the modern-day Czech Republic and the surrounding lands. And they were invited by the prince of this Great Moravian state in the Czech Republic, who wanted to solidify Christianity's hold on that area and also politically help distinguish himself from the Holy Roman Empire on his doorstep. Now, Cyril and Methodius, imitating those who carried the gospel to Georgia and Armenia, created a script, the Cyrillic alphabet, still essentially used in Russia and Ukraine and other Slavic states today, and they began translating the Bible and the liturgy into this Old West Slavonic language used in Greater Moravia. And their translations of the liturgy and the Bible are still being used in the Eastern Orthodox churches like Russia and Ukraine to this very day. Even though it now sounds so archaic, it's even harder to understand than, for example, Chaucer is to English. It's a step beyond even the Book of Common Prayer in the King James Version, and quite a step at that. But Cyril and Methodius, these radical missionaries wanting to translate things into a local language, were greatly opposed and even through conspiracy at one point imprisoned by missionaries from the West, from Charlemagne's realm, who were trying to impose Latin Western Christianity on the people and the Bible and the liturgy in Latin, a language that the people didn't understand. And although Cyril and Methodius appealed to the popes over the years and generally were quite well thought of by the popes, the Western missionaries would eventually get their way. And liturgy in the language of the people and faith in the language of the people would end up being banned and outlawed, and Cyril and Methodius' mission appear to have ended in failure. But like so many things, the seeds sown in one generation bear unexpected fruit in unexpected places in the next. Cast out from Moravia, the disciples, the next generation on from Cyril and Methodius, brought their vision of the Gospels and the liturgy being in the local language wherever they went. Key to this, they went to Bulgaria and other East Balkan states. Bulgaria had been Christian for some time, but under the influence of these new missionaries, the church really took off, because it was no longer going to be in Greek, but in the local language. And in 927, it became the first autocephalous, self-headed Slavic church, getting independence from Constantinople and the goodwill of the Byzantines. A similar thing happened in Serbia, which gained a good measure of independence in the early 1200s and full autocephaly in 1375. Under missionary work from Bulgarians, Romania likewise would become heavily Christianized, a nation which, unlike others, was much more Western in its culture and language, and to this day doesn't use Cyrillic, but uses the Latin alphabet that we use. With the Balkans experiencing a religious revival based on the principles of using the language of the people and the gospel being in their own language, people would begin to turn further north to the Slavic homelands of the Rus and their capital of centre and culture at the city of Kiev. Photius the Great had himself sent a bishop to Russia in 878, but he was killed by the local pagan ruler whose religion was quite similar to that of the Vikings and that kind of pagan religion. In 988, however, Vladimir the Great would convert to Christianity, and specifically to that of Constantinople and not that of Rome. Now, the possibly apocryphal and untrue story, although it is a good one, goes that he sent envoys to the major faiths and considered their findings. He rejected Islam because they forbade the consumption of alcohol. And what is a Russian without alcohol? In fact, it is said that Vladimir himself claimed that drinking is the joy of all Rus, and we cannot exist without that pleasure. And he rejected Judaism, for that they had lost Jerusalem and therefore clearly God had abandoned them. And he rejected Latin Christianity because he said it lacked beauty. But he embraced Byzantine Christianity and religion, for at the Hagia Sophia, the central cathedral of Eastern Orthodoxy in Constantinople, his envoys said, "We knew not where we were, in heaven or on earth. We only know that God dwells there among the people, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations." And that is an experience which is perhaps apocryphal, but I personally can relate to that, for it's something that deeply attracted me to Eastern Orthodoxy, and I almost joined the Eastern Orthodox Church at one point. And that is something very stark and interesting about them, is the beauty and ethereal nature of their worship, which seems to transport you out of this world. But whether true or not, Vladimir ended up marrying a Byzantine princess and cementing a military alliance with them, sending many troops and himself on campaign to fight some enemies of the Byzantine Empire, and in return gain their alliance. And on his return from that military campaign and the marriage, he destroyed all pagan monuments and temples and invested unbelievable wealth and time into creating churches and cathedrals and monasteries filled with gold and icons and all the trappings we would recognise as Eastern Orthodox churches today. Moved by the Gospels, he also introduced many new laws to protect the poor, the widow, the orphan, and he banned things like capital punishment and torture. There would be a revival within the Kievan Rus, spreading all the way from Kiev up to Novgorod and the northernmost parts of Russia. But in 1237, the Mongols, known as the Tatars among the Russians, if you ever happen to get confused reading other material on this subject. The Mongols and the Tatars are effectively the same thing. The Mongols arrived in 1237 and they brought a swift and violent and bloody and deadly end to the Kievan Rus. Burning, pillaging, massacres followed across the Slavic kingdoms and into Europe, with only the death of the great Khan stopping the advance of the hordes into Western Europe, and untold possible horrors in Italy and modern Germany. The Mongols, though, they remained in the heartlands of modern Russia and Ukraine, creating a state known as the Golden Horde, which would eventually convert to Islam. Though much of the Slavic heartland was now directly under Muslim control, Bulgaria was free but remained a vassal state to the Mongols, and the northern city of Novgorod remained independent but paid tribute to the Golden Horde. It was to that city, the city of Novgorod, that the future of Christianity in Russia would largely fall. It was a prosperous trading city, and it was here that one Alexander Nevsky in the early 1200s decided it was better to be free and Eastern Orthodox, but under the Mongol Muslim tribute state, than be subject to the Pope and have to embrace Western Christianity. And so he resisted and fought against the crusades of the Teutonic Order from the west and crusades from Sweden, and he placed his realm under the protection of the Mongols rather than embrace Western Christianity. Though evangelization in the Golden Horde, modern-day Ukraine and the south of Russia, was largely impossible, missionary monks spread out from Novgorod to the far north and over to the east into Siberia, living their lives in local communities among the tribespeople, and through love and care and translation work converting the peoples. Christianization and colonization, though usually not the imperial violent sort, generally went hand in hand through these monks and hermits, and the faith spread from people group to people group across the frozen tundra. Over time, the centre of power would shift from Novgorod to the more easternly state of Moscow, and resistance to the Golden Horde and its successors would increase till they were finally ended as a power in 1480. In 1503, Ivan the Great declared himself the ruler of all the Rus, and he married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. And so when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, he declared Moscow the successor of the Roman Empire and the Third Rome. The modern state of Russia was effectively born under the rule of his son, Ivan the Terrible. As in the Byzantine Empire, the church and the state would be closely entwined within the new Russia, two sides of the same coin, politics and religion effectively one. Taking up the mantle of the Third Rome would effectively set Russia on a collision course with the rest, which lasts culturally to this day. As Russia expanded eastward, so did missionary monks, and they were already operating in Alaska when it was sold to the United States in the 1800s, at which point it became difficult to keep a presence there. The history of a major schism between what's known as the Old Believers and the rest of the Russian Church in the 1600s, and the effects later of communism, will have to be left for another time. The spread of the Eastern Orthodox Church is an interesting and difficult one to grasp. At times it seems incredibly insular, and at others filled with missionary zeal. The close ties between church and state no doubt playing into this, as well as the contending with being under successive Islamic regimes and later under communism. At its best, the Eastern Orthodox did evangelism far better than any in the West were doing up until the Reformation, with the emphasis being on the use of the local language of the people and on social care and love of the people, work often carried out through monks and monasticism slowly spreading from community to community. At its worst, the expansion of Orthodoxy was incredibly imperialist and political and nationalist, and at times, sadly, was done in a harsh way with the repression and extinction of those who resisted. The deep tying of national, ethnic and religious identity among the Eastern Orthodox in the east of Europe is certainly a thing to behold, and it survived incredible opposition in a way not generally seen in the West, where Christian identity has steadily and dramatically declined. Next week we're going to turn from looking at greater movements such as the Crusades and the expansion of Eastern Orthodoxy back to looking at some key individuals in Western Christianity as we build up to the Reformation.